Hey there, and welcome to another deep dive. You've sent us a fascinating stack of sources, really, a deep look into the long, layered history of Peru, stretching from its very first urban centers right up to today. It's a country with just incredible depth, marked by ingenuity, collision, resilience, and constant change. Imagine peeling back layers of time like an archaeological dig, each one revealing surprising and sometimes a pretty challenging stories.
Exactly. And these sources offer a rich socio-historical perspective.
Yeah.
They really get into the structures of society, the laws, the cultural shifts, and, well, the ripple effects of major policy decisions, like that whole nationalization of education process.
Right. So our goal today is to explore this amazing path of sociocultural transformation. We're going to pull out the essential knowledge, the surprising facts, and, the key insights these sources give us to try and understand what Peru's past means for its present. Let's get started. We'll journey through the remarkable pre-Columbian world, the dramatic impact of the Spanish conquest, the complex colonial era, the often turbulent road to independence, the big upheavals of the 20th century, and how it all shapes contemporary Peru.
What's immediately clear from these sources is that Peru's history isn't just like a simple timeline. It's more a story where each era builds on the last, constantly transforming what came before, sometimes preserving things, sometimes destroying, sometimes creating something totally new.
And we're starting way back. The sources highlight the Norte Chico civilization, with archaeological evidence pushing dates back 4,000 years, maybe even earlier. Think about that. Advanced urban life flourishing in the arid Andes desert that long ago. These sources point to large sites built by thousands of people centuries before the merger pyramids and states we think about elsewhere.
And this is where it gets particularly interesting. Unlike those early cities in fertile lowlands, Norte Chico pops up along the coast. They're relying heavily on estuary fishing. The sheer scale of their architecture suggests a significant surplus of fish was managed through pretty organized labor.
Wow.
Yeah, the sources actually draw a parallel to ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt in terms of social stratification and complex production. But they point out this happened in what they call an extreme eco-environment. They needed robust civil engineering just to manage water and soil for farming in that landscape. Tells you a lot about their ingenuity.
Adapting to those harsh conditions is definitely a major insight. Okay, then we move north, right? To the Moche culture, thriving from what? Roughly 100 to 800 AD?
That's right. And these sources show the Moche were incredibly advanced, especially in agriculture. They developed these sophisticated irrigation systems in arid regions to grow crops we still recognize in Peru today. Maize, beans, cotton, loads of potato varieties. But their art is perhaps their most, striking legacy, according to these sources. They describe these elaborate ceremonial tombs for the elite, just filled with gold, silver, intricate pottery, jewelry, even evidence of hallucinogenic plants.
Really?
Yeah. And the vessels weren't just functional. They were art pieces depicting life, including what the sources call the wondrous and grotesque. The tomb of the Lord of Sipan is highlighted as magnificent beyond belief, gives us a real window into their beliefs in society.
Incredible. Okay. Down south, we find the Nazca culture, basically contemporaries of the Moche, running from about 100 BC to 800 AD, famous, obviously, for the Nazca lines.
Right. These enormous geoglyphs etched onto the desert floor, hundreds of meters long, showing animals, plants, geometric shapes. There's a simple technique, really, just removing dark pebbles to expose lighter soil, but on a massive scale.
Still hard to wrap your head around.
Totally. These lines, first really noted in 1927, they continue to challenge our understanding of ancient capabilities. The sources list figures like a monkey, spider, hummingbird, even something they call an astronaut.
An astronaut? Okay.
Yeah, it's intriguing. And a fascinating detail is that some lines show no cracking, suggesting they could be from the same general period when the Moche flourished. The sources also mention that high-quality Nazca ceramic art, it's now attributed to the culture based on recent tomb finds, even if it wasn't found directly at Nazca sites initially. Shows how our understanding keeps evolving with new evidence.
Okay. And finally, the big one, the Inca Empire. Emerging around 1200 CE, kind of the culmination of a lot of this regional development. The sources describe Manco Capac starting the process of uniting tribes, centering power in Cusco. And it expanded incredibly quickly, didn't it? By 1525, under Huayna Capac, it was this vast empire across all sorts of ecosystems.
It was huge. And the sources clarify that Inca actually means ruler. The people call themselves Runasimi.
That's a good point.
And an important insight from these sources is how we know about the Inca. A lot comes from oral traditions and later chronicles, But the sources caution against taking accounts like, say, Juan Poma de Ayala's as pure fact. They note they contain fictional and exaggerated stories.
Ah, okay, so archaeological evidence is key.
Definitely. Sites like Machu Picchu, Sacsayhuaman, they offer a more verifiable foundation for understanding their sophisticated organization and, daily life.
And based on that evidence, the sources suggest the Inca people generally lived in, well, material comfort before the Spanish showed up. So you have this immense, sophisticated empire, seemingly powerful, and then, like the sources dramatically put it, there's a break in continuity, a huge one.
That sudden collapse is a major insight.
Yeah.
The Spanish, led by Pizarro and Almagro, they'd made earlier attempts, but the main conquest really kicked off after Pizarro's third voyage in the 1530s.
And their motivation, the sources are pretty blunt about it. Fabulous treasures, vast wealth in gold and silver.
Exactly, that prospect of incredible personal wealth for European nobles, who the sources note weren't exactly used to austerity.
Right.
That was the key driver.
Right.
And the sources detail the incredibly arduous journey, the Pizarro-Almagro-Luque partnership, the disastrous first and second voyages. Almagro's first only had like a dozen men. The struggles to get funding, Pizarro being blockaded for 7 months in 1528. I mean, it wasn't just a walk in the park for them.
No, definitely not. And yet, the sources describe the empire falling quickly and catastrophically, a bloody juggernaut of disease and destruction.
And here's the crucial insight, the thing the sources really stress. While Spanish military tactics, swords and horses, played a role, the primary reason for the rapid collapse was European disease, especially smallpox. The Incas had zero immunity. It wasn't just people getting sick. It was an epidemic that absolutely devastated the population, killed the ruler, the whole dynasty, and basically dismantled the complex administrative network holding the empire together.
Wow. So the empire was fatally weakened from the inside first.
Precisely. And the sources highlight another huge internal factor, that devastating civil war between the half-brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa. It was already raging when Pizarro arrived.
Convenient timing for the Spanish.
Extremely. They cleverly exploited it, got involved to gain an advantage. After Atahualpa won, many top Inca leaders were already dead or scattered, damaging the dynasty even further. And this internal conflict actually simmered on, sporadically, for decades after the initial conquest.
So it's this perfect storm, really.
That's the key insight the sources offer for the speed of the collapse. Disease epidemics plus internal civil war. And conquering the Inca Empire, the largest in the Americas, with all that mineral wealth, was absolutely the ultimate prize for these conquistadors. The potential rewards were just unprecedented.
And even the Spanish couldn't keep it together. The sources point out that prolonged infighting among the Spanish themselves for dominance of the empire and treasure was a major factor.
Oh, absolutely. That conflict between Pizarro and Almagro was particularly brutal. It led to basically a civil war among the conquerors.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. The sources describe Pizarro setting up Lima as the capital because of the port access and the rivalry just escalating. Almagro's faction plotted to take Cusco. Pizarro got help from indigenous groups who were against the Incas anyway, headed off Almagro, and won. But here's a striking detail. Pizarro was apparently right on the verge of permanently dissolving the Inca monarchy when he himself was assassinated by Almagro's supporters. They wanted his power too.
So even as they were conquering, they were basically tearing each other apart.
Wild.
Okay, so with the Spanish arrival becoming decisive and the Inca elite falling in the 1530s, the colonial period really takes hold. The sources describe it starting with the, treacherous capture and execution of Atahualpa as the Spanish played on those existing indigenous rivalries.
Right. And the sources emphasize that the Spanish quickly targeted the Inca elite. That effectively severed the state's ability to control the economy, run the provinces, tax people, or even maintain their own ideology. But establishing full control wasn't easy at all. It was met with constant protests, reversals, rebellions, just deep hostility from the indigenous population.
So resistance was a constant feature, it sounds like it. The sources mention Spanish attempts to destroy or co-opt native structures in the provinces, the messy results of the encomienda system.
Which was basically that grant of native labor and tribute to colonists.
Right, and even that led to fighting among the conquerors themselves. Indigenous groups sometimes even allied with their traditional neighbors against the Spanish. Revolts flared up over land grabs, tribute demands, made worse by resentment against lowland settlers who, the sources say, stripped the land and extorted labor and tribute.
And the sources also highlight conflicts within the colonial system. Spanish and indigenous officials often distrusted each other. Sometimes Spanish officials even sided with indigenous governors against abusive Spanish colonists. You had the viceroys in Lima constantly battling the local councils, the cabildos.
The city governing bodies.
Exactly. They represented local interests and used the councils as places for opposition and, legal challenges. It was messy.
That complexity raises a key question. What was daily life actually like for most people? The sources are clear. From Lima's founding, society was rigidly stratified: race, class, land ownership. Whites consolidated power, while this large population of mixed-race individuals, mestizos, mulattoes, and a subordinate indigenous population emerged.
Lima, established as the capital of the viceroyalty in 1535, it became this major center, a grand capital of the Spanish Empire, as the sources put it. But they note the huge divide between the resource-rich highlands and the coastal ports like Lima. The white elite were constantly jockeying for power over estates and trade. And while the system generated wealth for some, it severely restricted access to capital and opportunity for the lower classes.
Yet the sources also describe Lima as an unusual environment for social development, a web of cultural diffusion where merchants and others lived publicly. So despite formal segregation, economic and political power were all tangled up. Public spaces became sites of rivalry among different castes, elites. It's a much deeper picture than just black and white.
Absolutely. And administering that huge territory to wanton Suyu spanning multiple modern countries, it was tough. Those sources point out it wasn't a unified state originally. Areas nominally ruled by the Inca had their own diverse laws, languages. Real territorial unity under one administration only came after the Spanish conquest, and the coast was vulnerable to pirates from England, France, the Caribbean.
Thinking about the long-term impacts, these sources actually connect ongoing problems in Peru today, things like political instability, resource conflicts, back to reforms and changes much later in the 1970s.
That connection is an important insight, yeah. The sources show that agrarian reforms in the early 1970s drastically altered land ownership in the highlands. It immediately reduced the power of the big landowners, the hacendados.
The ones with the vast estates, the latifundios, relying on indigenous peasant labor?
Exactly. Many of these estates were turned into cooperatives. Now, this opened some doors, definitely, but the results really varied depending on local conditions.
So these reforms were trying to break that historical power dynamic rooted way back in the colonial past. The sources also mention improvements driven by African and indigenous rights movements. But here's a really striking detail. They find that some social welfare and literacy campaigns back then were based on this prejudiced idea that indigenous peasants were somehow incapable of becoming full citizens. Citizenship was basically conditional on adopting westernizing cultural reforms.
Wow. Yeah, that ties directly into the complex story of cultural assimilation versus resistance. The sources reiterate that while transformation was continuous, so much of Inca society was purposely destroyed, removed, or stolen during the conquest. Gold melted, clothing shredded, murals ruined, indigenous values were lost, looked down upon, or only selectively borrowed. It contributed to what the sources describe as a prejudiced, hybrid mestizo identity, a blending but not always an equitable one.
The sources also mention these displacement migrations, often led by women, from rural areas hit hard by violence into the cities. Women's self-help groups helped people adjust, but sometimes newcomers felt pressure to deny their indigenous identity to fit in. But later, these same organizations became really important platforms for women and assimilated migrants to demand political and social change. Shows how resistance and adaptation just kept going, finding new forms. Okay, so as we move into the 19th century, the sources show South America's independence movements were definitely influenced by what was happening elsewhere: North America, Europe, and especially Napoleon invading Spain in 1808.
Right, that weakened Spanish power significantly opened the door for ideas based on natural rights.
But what's particularly insightful for Peru, according to these sources, is that independence wasn't really this clear internal revolution from the get-go. It was, as they put it, more as a consequence of events than as a goal in itself.
Interesting. So initially, the main feeling was loyalty to the Spanish king, Fernando VII.
Seems like it. Unlike other places, the sources note a strong internal revolutionary movement didn't quite form in the same way early on. Even the U.S. declaration didn't really resonate directly in the Andes at first.
Lima remained this key center of Spanish power, aristocracy, connected by trade, even if other areas were isolated. But discontent was certainly brewing by 1814.
Yeah. And these sources touch on early revolts in this period, but they also make this interesting connection much later, linking the structural roots of 20th century violence, like the Shining Path insurgency starting after 1980.
Right, linking it back to recurring issues like military dictatorships and the lack of smooth democratic transitions in the 20th century. The sources even quote Abimael Guzman, the Shining Path leader, back in 1980. He's saying the suffering of the poor was because the elite couldn't govern, and that only socialism could liberate people.
And a critical insight offered here is that while Peruvian insurgents often believed a revolutionary situation existed, the sources argue they didn't fully grasp the inherent stability and durability of the Peruvian state and its armed forces. They described the state in the mid-60s and 80s as democratically representative and politically strong, pointing to elections happening despite military interventions and an expanding democracy overall.
And later groups like AMR and ELN in the 20th century, they drew inspiration from figures like Che Guevara and Castro in Cuba. So those external influences remained a factor.
Okay, circling back to the pre-independence era, the sources mention Viceroy Manuel Gurior, also known as Superunda, arriving in 1777 right into this growing discontent. They note popular petitions, criticisms of his government, even mentions women's honors being postponed. Gurior made some concessions, but apparently with little real impact.
And then they state the arrival of the rebel Tupac Amaru pushed the viceroy into a defensive war.
No, wait, the sources previously discussed the Tupac Amaru II revolt in 1780 in the context of colonial resistance, right?
Exactly. His mention here, relative to a viceroy arriving in 77, highlights that his major revolt, or at least the climate leading up to it, was this significant late colonial upheaval. It directly contributed to the pressures building towards independence. The sources describe his 1780 rebellion leading to Indian masses rising up, temporarily gaining power, even though it was ultimately crushed. It's a crucial moment of large-scale indigenous resistance right before independence.
Got it. Okay, so Peru's Declaration of Independence finally comes July 28, 1821, proclaimed by José de la Riva Agüero in Lima. Simon Bolívar's Gran Colombia recognized it shortly after.
And the sources describe the initial acts of the new republic: writing decrees, constitutions, dividing territory, forming the army and navy, all the foundational stuff.
The first popular election was in 1822. The General Assembly convened later that year with Bolívar is described as a major foundational work, constitutive, republican, federal, and liberal.
But then it gets dissolved by General Agustin Gamarra in 1823. Just highlights the instability that was coming.
Yeah, the sources are pretty frank, describing Peru's subsequent political history as marked by a cruel absence of liberty, even likening political failures to a state crime. Despite documented progress, they feel there's a lot of mixed work and, well, obliterated hopes to confront in understanding this period.
Yeah, the 19th century after independence. It's portrayed in these sources as just immensely difficult. The language is striking. War, bloodshed, war again, civil wars, insanity, horror, tears, lost hopes. And then there's that slightly cryptic phrase, the victor was a foreigner and the Mona conquered and drilled Lima.
Right, the Mona. What does that even mean? The sources don't really explain it.
No, they don't. But the overall point seems to underscore this struggle for true national sovereignty and the continued influence or conflict involving outside forces or perhaps groups perceived as foreign, destabilizing the capital.
So, organizing the new republic, trying to make free institutions work in what the sources call a desert full of tyrants, clearly a massive challenge. Discontented, powerful figures, some kicked out by the liberators, formed groups trying to rid Lima of this perceived national scourge, again, possibly referring to a foreigner or foreign influence.
And this led to what the sources call 10 years of blood, war, and dishonor. Bolívar temporarily regained control, but civil conflict just continued, culminating in General Salivari's dictatorship.
And get this, the sources say that despite this constant chaos, president changes, civil wars. 5 new constitutions were written during that 10-year period alone.
5. Wow. That just gives you a sense of the constant, often violent attempts to redefine the nation's structure.
Yeah. So the path to establishing the republic was incredibly messy. Revolts were ongoing, but figures like Riva Agüero and Sánchez Carrión eventually brought some focus. While systems like law and trade carried over, Madrid's weakness and the autonomy of local centers, like those cabildos, created this complex connection and disconnection with the rest of South America. Lima's history kept it central, though.
The sources mention a pro-independence junta popping up in Lima in 1820, which failed, replaced by another one that declared independence in 1821. The independence of other South American nations definitely pressured Peru towards change, but it also led to huge societal disruption and internal conflict. And the early Republican Congress really struggled. The sources note they weren't even initially given a copy of the Constitution they were supposed to be working with.
There's also mention of conflict with New Spanish America in 1825, involving battles with Chile and Colombia. A figure named Manuel Maria de la Torre is mentioned taking over from Congress later. The source has a weird note of 1873, but contextually it seems earlier, maybe 1820s or 30s. He tried to restore stability, but was eventually forced out.
So the core insight for this whole period is really that the country became faction-ridden and disjointed, mostly controlled by caudillos.
These local or regional military strongmen.
Exactly, with their unarmed groups constantly fighting civil wars.
And this cycle just continued through the 19th century. Civil wars, political instability, strikes, protests, demands for social justice, especially from indigenous populations wanting agrarian reforms because of poor treatment and land issues. The sources mention a deadly uprising in Huaycan. The military's power, though huge, was repeatedly challenged by civilian unrest.
The sources also describe a later government. This sounds more like the 20th century, led by a figure named Morales, facing intense pressure from competing forces. They mention a decree to seize land for peasants, an army general being assassinated, an attempted murder of Morales himself, leaked secret talks. Just deadlock, leading to more turmoil. A struggle between repression and negotiation, attacked by the press, military threats. The sources say excessive violence was expected. Grim.
Okay, shifting to the economy. The sources offer an interesting insight by dividing Peru's economic history into periods. The colonial economy, built on Spanish and Inca elements, focused monopolistically on precious metals, right?
Yeah, lacked a real internal market, limited urban growth outside the main centers, poor communications. Early Europeans apparently saw Peru as somewhat barbaric, less gold than they hoped, kind of an unimportant region initially.
But then the 19th century brought huge mechanized economic change. The nation-state emerged from the decline of silver, fundamentally transformed by the global demand for guano.
Guano, bird droppings, amazing fertilizer, and coal for railroads. This industrial revolution spurred demand for Andean raw materials and labor. But a dark insight is how supposed free labor devolved into really harsh, chattel-like indentures. It led to searches for foreign labor and demands for better conditions by the late 1800s.
And an interesting detail. Guano export money was often sent abroad. When the government stepped in during a depression, those receipts actually decreased. The sources note this political order where foreigners gained increasing rights while politics wasn't really citizen-based. British interests even argued for separating economics and politics to avoid taxes.
And the sources conclude the country became pulverized as petty states, easily influenced by foreign powers like Chile, the U.S., Brazil, Bolivia. Okay, first half of the 20th century. It brought modernization, yeah, but also deep contradictions and a lot of unrest. Liberal elites were pushing to expand markets, but this was met with revolts from peasants suffering really oppressive conditions.
Right. Indigenous groups, leftists joined strikes, often facing state repression or maybe co-option. And the sources highlight this insight that class struggle became really racialized. Elites either aligned with American interests or tried to, reinforce those old colonial racial hierarchies.
The sources mention the late 1950s, noting the presence of polistas and describing Lima, dominated by the Peruvian elite, with café, mentioned as isolated pockets of Western culture.
Polistas. Café. What are those referring to exactly?
Well, the sources don't explicitly define them, but the context suggests they might represent different cultural or regional influences, maybe from Brazil, maybe other foreign enclaves, or just distinct cultural groups, highlighting a kind of fragmentation or cultural contrast within Peru at the time. Meanwhile, vibrant indigenous religious festivals persisted. Post-WWII saw increased U.S. influence everywhere in Latin America, and then, of course, the Cuban Revolution was a huge inspiration for revolutionary movements.
And then comes 1968, a major turning point. A military junta led by General Juan Velasco Alvarado.
Huge. Their program aimed to help impoverished natives and mestizos. A radical land reform was central, directly targeting the plight of natives described in the sources as unbelievably, virtually slaves, large estates, semi-feudal systems, dismantled.
And then they confiscated 2/3 of the businessmen's total assets.
That's what the sources state. A drastic move. The result: many of Peru's elite just left, retreated abroad. Simultaneously, the armed forces were deeply committed to crushing any revolutionary movements.
And the sources mention this dark period between the early 80s and something vaguely called fashionista and lifestyle of Peru, where many artists, musicians, poets were assassinated or exiled, just underscores the intense political repression and violence.
Yeah. The early 80s and 90s were marked by increased violence, especially in the Andes, alongside total economic collapse. Scattered leftist groups had existed, but the sources identify the Sendero Luminoso, the shining path, emerging in 1980 as a group that really galvanized resistance into this brutal insurgency.
Okay, let's look closer at the Shining Path. The sources describe them pursuing a Maoist revolution through just extreme violence, aiming to destroy existing society by exterminating anyone they deemed politically or ideologically impure. Brutal.
And the sources offer an interesting insight here. They suggest that while, totalitarianism, Marxism, widespread violence were new to Peru in this form, certain aspects of Peruvian religion or maybe deep-seated social structures might have lent themselves to a militaristic, almost apocalyptic revolutionary appeal, especially for a disempowered population facing really rigid social hierarchies. Marxism, in this context, seemed to morph into the revenge of the dispossessed.
The sources give some really unsettling specifics about the insurgency: terrorism, kidnappings, violent attacks continuing into the 90s. They mention a plane crash in 91, subsequent losses during recovery efforts. And a particularly chilling detail highlights an ambush of armed forces troops on July 30, 1992, described as spectacularly successful. The sources say it turned the tables, gained notoriety, even implying it targeted a multinational military presence.
Wow. They also mention major bombings in Lino Plaza de Armas, Congress, and intense anti-terrorism repression. A particularly harrowing incident from '95 is described, the capture of 25 students and 5 professors from a university. There's a weird parenthetical note about believing in vouchers.
Vouchers. Odd detail.
Very odd. But the sources describe this incident as having a higher death toll involving middle-class students, with this strange detail about parents supposedly vouching for the Shining Path's leniency. It's just a complex, disturbing detail about how far the conflict reached.
And the sources also touch on this recurring theme of authoritarian regimes. After a government collapse way back in 1879, an attempted coup in 1948, Peru was ruled by civilian elites for a long stretch. 5 men held the presidency for 50 years, 1881-1931. The public was just exhausted by instability and corruption.
Right. And the insight here is that elite self-interest, collusion with foreign interests.
Yeah.
It meant they struggled to govern, except basically on their own terms.
The sources mention General Odria ousting Leoncio Prado in 1948. Then, another military coup, October 3, 1968, deposing Odria's government, which the sources bizarrely call the first successful coup against a coup.
A coup against a coup. Interesting framing. Apparently, the army was initially presented as liberators, seen as popularly supported, like the fight against the Spanish centuries before. This military takeover was initially viewed by some as a glorious revolution, a significant revolutionary moment in its own right.
Fascinating that a military intervention could be seen that way. But the sources also discuss concurrent movements for democratic reforms. Reformers in the 60s and 70s aimed to fundamentally transform society, tackle the costs of capitalism, poverty, inequality, lack of democracy, the dominance of international capital.
These reformers really wanted deep change. The sources highlight the Regional Group for Agrarian Reform, RGAF, formed in '69 after the '68 coup. They became a key player in that radical agrarian reform. Their view was that development meant liberation from U.S. political and economic control. They were pushing for an authentic, self-sustained economic model and dismantling those rigid power structures inherited from history.
And there's that powerful quote from General Velasco Alvarado, leader of the '68 government, captured in the sources. This revolution would account for very little if it simply aspired to modernize the country. For us, development necessarily needs the fundamental transformation of the political and economic relationships that organized our society.
Yeah, that really sums up the ambition of that whole period of reform. Powerful words.
So we've traced this incredibly complex journey, from ancient innovation and vast empires, through dramatic conquest, resistance under colonial rule, a tumultuous path to independence and civil conflict, then radical reforms, devastating insurgencies in the 20th century. The sources bring us to contemporary Peru, framing it as a continuation of this process, sociocultural transformation, where layers are built upon or, reacted against.
Yeah, the sources really drive home the reality and depth of information and richness of culture. Across all these periods, you see it in the skill of the early artist, the blend of Spanish and indigenous styles in the colonial era, the intricate social hierarchies. Contemporary Peru, these sources suggest, is this rich tapestry. It's difficult to capture without oversimplifying or overlooking complexities like, say, the emergence of proletarian literature happening alongside centuries of racism and the legacies of conquest.
Right. The sources mention efforts like the Year of Peru program at Kent State University, aiming to build a more sophisticated understanding of Peru today. Highlighting its history and creativity, sure, but also acknowledging that for Peruvians, it's a time to grapple with national identity and how the past actively shapes the present.
Which leads to a key insight from these sources. How does a nation actually reconcile such deep, sometimes painful historical layers? The sources describe Peruvians often seeing themselves as this hybrid mestizo, a blend of pure and mixed bloodlines. It's complex.
Okay, looking at the economy now. The sources discuss the period after the social unrest and the political transition in the late 70s, which brought a new constitution in 79 and a return to democracy. But the new government faced just massive challenges: political turmoil, tricky military relations, and a sharp economic decline.
And this is where the sources paint a really stark picture. By October 1980, the country was in severe crisis. They cite unprecedented hyperinflation, peaking at an absolutely astonishing 82% month-on-month in 1989.
82% in a month.
Insane. Real wages plummeted by 25%. Huge fiscal deficits, state enterprises went bankrupt, credit dried up, the exchange rate collapsed, an 822% devaluation in 1989 alone. And the most devastating failure, they note, was poverty, affecting about half the population by 1990.
Sounds like the country was right on the brink of total collapse.
Pretty much. But the sources also highlight a rapid period of reform between 1990 and 1994, leading to notable successes. Obstacles for the private sector were removed, the exchange rate stabilized, exports surged, and hyperinflation was finally stopped.
So a major turnaround.
A huge shift. The sources track Peru's economic path from 1990 to 2017, showing this push for sustained growth, becoming a middle-income country. The insight here is that fundamental shift from state interventionism to a market-oriented approach. Privatization, reforms to boost competitiveness, entering new markets through trade agreements.
And social movements and human rights. Crucial threads throughout this whole history. The sources emphasize Peru as a multi-ethnic nation over 80 ethnic groups, 15 language families. They stress that understanding this deep history is essential to move past prejudice against indigenous populations and avoid those simplistic, exotic stereotypes.
Yeah, and the sources note that after independence, the whole idea of race actually became more rigid, not less. The Creole elite, having overthrown Spanish rule, faced the challenge of governing a territory where most people were indigenous, seen as outsiders. This created this tense situation that eventually led to the potential for indigenous movements. But the sources argue this required forging a sense of shared identity, an awareness of a shared history of oppression, and crucially, means of communication.
They list those cumulative grievances: poverty, social exclusion, directly linking Spanish domination to ill treatment by Creole elites after independence. Forging that shared identity based on appearance, language, customs, religion, helped along by ethnic associations and media, it became necessary for these movements to emerge.
The idea of a cultural renaissance is also explored. The sources revisit the colonial period's segregated structure, the wealth flowing to Spain from Lima, the harsh reality for the indigenous population versus the luxury of some. And they reiterate that native resistance was constant, sparking early independence movements, including that significant Tupac Amaru II revolt in 1780, where indigenous masses rose up, gained power before being defeated. That earlier revolt is seen as foundational.
Right. The sources state that by 1830, Peru saw this mix of slow democratization and bloody dictatorship. And while the mid-19th century brought railways and economic growth, like that guano boom.
The glamorous guano boom.
Exactly. But that prosperity often didn't reach rural areas, which just intensified conflicts between landowners and natives over land dispossession.
And as an attempt to stop revolts, the sources mention a policy of parceling land to peasants. The expectation was they become civilized through ownership. But indigenous ancestry was often ignored or devalued in this process, leading to more clashes. Then, in 1911, indigenismo emerged, this ideology specifically defending indigenous culture, language, institutions, history against what was seen as an ongoing invasion or marginalization narrative, and it linked up with indigenous movements across the continent.
Okay, finally, looking at Peru in the global context, the sources reinforce that idea of continuous transformation. Efforts like that Year of Peru program at KSU aim to counter simple stereotypes, create a more nuanced image of Peru on the world stage, one that isn't just ancient history, but a vibrant, complex, modern society.
And the sources discuss international relations, giving a specific example: those border landmines with Ecuador. They link this to the Shining Path insurgency in the 80s, suggesting the conflict diverted attention. A peace process, partly helped by global events like the Gulf War diverting attention elsewhere, led to successful trust-building measures. like joint mine clearing with Ecuador, helping reduce decades of suspicion, even if information sharing wasn't always perfectly equal.
And trade agreements are highlighted as crucial tools now. Since that 1990s shift to a market economy, Peru's actively pursued agreements to become more competitive globally, enter new markets. It reflects a deliberate strategy in its foreign commerce.
And cultural diplomacy using culture, soft power, to improve international perception is showcased through things like that USMP-KSU partnership and the Year of Peru program. The sources emphasize this isn't just broadcasting a message one way. It's meant to be a two-way exchange that reveals the complex web of relationships, power dynamics, and global positioning Peru navigates today.
Wow, that was truly a deep dive, exploring the incredible layers of Peru's history. We've gone from the ingenious adaptation of ancient civilizations like Norte Chico, the artistic heights of the Moche, the mysteries of the Nazca lines, to the vast, sophisticated Inca Empire and its dramatic collapse, fueled by disease and civil war at the hands of the Spanish.
Yeah, we've seen the long, often brutal colonial period marked by constant resistance, the forging of that complex, sometimes prejudiced hybrid identity, and internal power struggles on all sides. We trace the tumultuous fight for independence, the century of civil wars and caudillo rule, and the 20th century defined by cycles of attempted radical reform, devastating violence from groups like Shining Path, and shifts between authoritarian and democratic rule. It's a lot.
And we've ended in contemporary Peru, a vibrant, multi-ethnic nation grappling with the persistent legacies of poverty and inequality, navigating global economic currents while its people continue to express incredible cultural resilience and, define their place in the world.
The sources consistently remind us that Peru is this dynamic story of sociocultural transformation, built on layers of cultural borrowing, adaptation, creation, but also marked by profound loss and the complexity of a hybrid identity forged under really challenging circumstances. It is, like the sources suggest, a tapestry woven from diverse peoples and processes.
It really makes you think about how deeply history is embedded in the challenges but also the strengths of a nation today. The sources conclude that Peruvians are heirs to this magnificent past, racially and culturally diverse, facing problems that are directly rooted in this complex blending of populations over millennia.
Their story, the sources argue, is a remarkable story in progress, an embrace of ethnicity, religion, language, national identity that reflects both its deep past and its, evolving present. Like creation myths, it's partly real, partly aspirational, constantly being negotiated, reinterpreted, and transformed.
So here's maybe a final provocative thought for you to mull over. If a nation's identity is constantly being negotiated and reshaped, layered with such deep, sometimes conflicting histories, what does that tell us about the very nature of identity itself, both personal and national? We hope this deep dive has offered you a richer, maybe more nuanced understanding of Peru's incredible and complex journey. Thanks for joining us and keep exploring.